MKUltra. During the height of the Cold War, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, launched one of the most infamous and secretive research programs in U.S. history, Project MKUltra. Running from the 1950s to the early 1970s, MKUltra was a sprawling effort to study mind control, interrogation, and behavior modification, often through experiments that flagrantly violated medical ethics and human rights. The program was born from fear. After reports that the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea were experimenting with psychological manipulation, U.S. intelligence sought its own methods of controlling or breaking the human mind. Under MKUltra, researchers tested drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and electroshock as tools for interrogation and control. The most infamous element was the use of LSD. The CIA funded secret experiments where subjects, sometimes volunteers, sometimes unsuspecting citizens, were dosed with hallucinogens to observe their reactions. College students, prisoners, hospital patients, and even CIA employees were used as test subjects, often without informed consent. In some cases, people were drugged in safe houses or brothels rigged with two-way mirrors, as agents observed the psychological effects. The experiments often left participants traumatized. Some suffered permanent psychological damage. One government scientist, Frank Olson, died after allegedly being dosed with LSD without his knowledge, in what some consider a suspicious suicide. For decades, MKUltra remained hidden. It was not until the mid-1970s when investigations by the U.S. Senate, the Church Committee, and journalists exposed its scope that the truth came to light. Even then, much of the evidence was destroyed when the CIA director ordered files shredded in 1973. What survives is only a fragment of the program's full extent. The scandal of MKUltra lies in its betrayal of ethics and trust. Under the guise of national security, the U.S. government sanctioned experiments that ignored consent, inflicted harm, and treated human beings as disposable tools. Today, MKUltra stands as a stark reminder of the dangers of secrecy and unchecked power in science, showing how the pursuit of control can turn research into abuse. The Guatemala Syphilis Experiments. In the late 1940s, American researchers carried out a series of secret medical experiments in Guatemala that are now regarded as one of the darkest chapters in the history of public health. Between 1946 and 1948, U.S. government doctors, working with Guatemalan authorities, deliberately infected vulnerable people with sexually transmitted diseases in order to study potential treatments. For decades, the experiments remained hidden until their shocking details were revealed in the early 21st century. The project was led by Dr. John Cutler, a U.S. Public Health Service physician who would later be involved in the Tuskegee syphilis study. The aim was to test the effectiveness of penicillin in preventing and treating syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid. To do this, the researchers exposed subjects directly to infection. Soldiers, prisoners, psychiatric patients, and even orphans were targeted, many without their knowledge or consent. Some were deliberately inoculated with pathogens through needles or placed in situations where infection was virtually guaranteed. The scale of abuse was staggering. More than 1,300 individuals were involved, and while some were treated with penicillin, many never received proper care. Several participants died as a direct or indirect result of the experiments, and many more lived with long-term physical and psychological harm. The scandal remained hidden for decades until historian Susan Reverby uncovered archival documents in 2010, bringing the experiments to light. The revelations sparked international outrage. In 2010, the U.S. government issued a formal apology, with President Barack Obama personally apologizing to the president of Guatemala and describing the experiments as clearly unethical. A subsequent investigation confirmed the abuses and condemned the lack of informed consent and disregard for human dignity. The Guatemala Syphilis Experiments are remembered today as a sobering reminder that even in the modern era, science has been misused to exploit vulnerable populations. They highlight the dangers of secrecy, racism, and disregard for human rights in medical research. Their exposure has since fueled renewed calls for transparency, accountability, and stronger global protections in human subject experimentation. The Little Albert Experiment. In 1920, American psychologist John B. Watson and his graduate student Rosalie Rayner carried out one of the most infamous studies in the history of psychology, the Little Albert Experiment. Often cited as a landmark in behaviorism, the study became equally notorious for its profound ethical violations. Watson was eager to demonstrate that emotions such as fear could be conditioned, rather than being innate. To test this, he recruited an infant known only as Albert B., an 11-month-old boy whose mother worked at the hospital where the study was conducted. At first, Albert was exposed to various objects: a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, and even masks. He showed no fear and even reached out to play with them. The experiment then took a darker turn. Whenever Albert touched the white rat, Watson and Rayner struck a steel bar with a hammer behind his head, producing a loud, frightening noise. After several repetitions, Albert began crying and avoiding the rat altogether. Soon, his fear generalized. He reacted with distress not only to the rat, but also to similar objects: rabbits, fur coats, even masks. The results seemed to support Watson's claim that fear could be conditioned and transferred to other stimuli. But the ethical problems were staggering. Albert was subjected to deliberate psychological harm without consent, and there is no record that his conditioned fears were ever reversed. His fate remains unclear. Some accounts suggest he died young from unrelated illness, while others claim he lived into adulthood with lingering anxieties. The Little Albert Experiment is remembered today less as a triumph of science and more as a cautionary tale. It highlighted the dangers of using vulnerable populations, in this case, an infant, as test subjects without safeguards. Modern psychology textbooks cite it as an example of why informed consent, debriefing, and protection from harm are essential to any human research. What began as a demonstration of behaviorism instead became one of the most notorious lapses in research ethics, proving that the pursuit of knowledge is never justification for cruelty. The Tearoom Trade Study. In 1970, sociologist Laud Humphreys published Tearoom Trade: Impersonal Sex in Public Places, a book based on research that became one of the most controversial social science studies ever conducted. While it provided groundbreaking insights into hidden aspects of human behavior, it was also condemned for gross violations of privacy, deception, and ethics. Humphreys set out to study anonymous sexual encounters between men in public restrooms, then known in slang as tea rooms. At the time, homosexuality was heavily stigmatized and often criminalized. Humphreys posed as a watch queen, a lookout who kept watch during encounters in order to observe participants without their knowledge. He recorded detailed notes about their behaviors, but what made the study especially scandalous was how far he went to gather personal information. Using license plate numbers from participants' cars, Humphreys tracked down their home addresses. A year later, he disguised himself as a health researcher and visited these men in their homes, interviewing them about their lives, marriages, and social backgrounds, without ever revealing that he had previously observed them in tea room encounters. The findings were striking. Contrary to stereotypes, Humphreys discovered that many of the men were married, middle class, and otherwise lived conventional lives. Only a minority identified as gay. His work challenged simplistic ideas about sexuality, showing how social pressures and stigma shaped people's behaviors and identities. But the backlash was immense. Critics accused Humphreys of serious ethical breaches, deception, violation of privacy, and putting participants at risk of exposure and legal consequences. Had the men been identified, their lives could have been destroyed. The study sparked intense debates about whether the pursuit of knowledge justified such invasions of personal autonomy. Today, the Tearoom Trade Study is remembered as a double-edged sword. It expanded sociological understanding of hidden sexual subcultures, but it also became a case study in what not to do in research ethics. It forced social sciences to adopt stricter standards of consent, confidentiality, and respect for subjects, ensuring that future studies could not replicate its methods. Operation Whitecoat. In the 1950s through the 1970s, the United States Army conducted a research program known as Operation Whitecoat. Unlike many other controversial experiments of the era, this program is remembered as both ethically complex and medically significant. It stands out because, unlike Tuskegee or Guatemala, the participants were not deceived, but it still raised deep questions about the boundaries of human experimentation. The participants were largely Seventh-day Adventists, a Christian denomination with many members who were conscientious objectors to war. Instead of bearing arms, these young men were given the option of contributing to national defense through medical research. More than 2,000 soldiers volunteered, believing they were serving both their faith and their country. At Fort Detrick, Maryland, the hub of America's biological warfare research, the volunteers were exposed to a variety of pathogens, vaccines, and experimental treatments. Tests included exposure to Q fever, tularemia, yellow fever, Rift Valley fever, and other potentially dangerous microbes. The men were monitored closely, sometimes confined in isolation units, while scientists observed disease progression and treatment effectiveness. The purpose was to advance defenses against biological weapons during the Cold War, as fears of germ warfare loomed large. What made Operation Whitecoat controversial was not that volunteers were uninformed, but that they were placed in situations of real risk. Although most survived without long-term harm, some suffered serious illness and lingering effects. The balance between patriotic service, religious duty, and scientific risk has fueled debate ever since. Supporters argue that Operation Whitecoat produced vital medical knowledge, helping to develop vaccines, treatments, and protocols that saved lives worldwide. Critics counter that it placed vulnerable young men in harm's way under the pressure of military hierarchy and the moral weight of war. When the program ended in 1973, it left behind a legacy far less infamous than Tuskegee or MKUltra, but still controversial. Operation Whitecoat continues to be studied in discussions of bioethics, informed consent, and the morality of using soldiers as test subjects in the pursuit of science and security. The Hwang Woo-suk stem cell fraud. In the early 2000s, South Korea rose to the forefront of global science headlines thanks to Dr. Hwang Woo-suk, a veterinarian-turned-biologist who claimed to have achieved the impossible, creating human embryonic stem cells through cloning. His research promised revolutionary medical breakthroughs, cures for degenerative diseases, organ regeneration, and even a new era of personalized medicine. By 2004 and 2005, his name was synonymous with national pride and scientific glory. But behind the acclaim lay one of the most elaborate scientific frauds in modern history. Hwang published 2 landmark papers in Science magazine, claiming his team had successfully cloned human embryos and derived stem cell lines from them. The work seemed to position South Korea as a leader in biotechnology. The government showered him with funding, and the media celebrated him as a hero. At the height of the hype, Hwang was treated almost like a celebrity, the man who could put Korea on the map as a biotech superpower. But doubts began to surface. In late 2005, whistleblowers and investigative journalists exposed inconsistencies in his data. Independent labs failed to replicate his results. Further investigations revealed the truth. The supposedly cloned stem cells had been fabricated. No human embryonic stem cells had ever been successfully created by Hwang's team. To make matters worse, it was discovered that many of the human egg cells used in his research had been obtained unethically. Some donated by junior researchers under pressure, others purchased in violation of ethical guidelines. The fallout was enormous. Hwang's papers were retracted, his reputation destroyed, and South Korea plunged into scandal. He was later convicted of embezzlement and bioethics violations, though he avoided lengthy prison time. The betrayal stung deeply, not only because of the scientific fraud, but because of the national hopes tied to his work. The Hwang Woo-suk scandal remains a defining case of scientific misconduct. It underscores how ambition, national pride, and the race for prestige can distort the pursuit of truth. While stem cell research has since advanced legitimately, the episode stands as a stark reminder that science, without transparency and ethics, can quickly turn from promise to scandal. Fritz Haber and chemical warfare. Few figures in science embody the moral contradictions of discovery as starkly as Fritz Haber. A German chemist of Jewish descent, Haber made groundbreaking contributions that both saved millions of lives and condemned countless others to death. His legacy is inseparably tied to the dawn of chemical warfare during the First World War. Haber's greatest achievement came in 1909 when he and Carl Bosch developed the Haber-Bosch process, a method for synthesizing ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen. This innovation revolutionized agriculture by making artificial fertilizers widely available, dramatically increasing food production. For this, Haber received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1918 and is often credited with helping feed the world. But Haber's brilliance took a darker turn during the First World War. As Germany sought new weapons to break the stalemate of trench warfare, he became the driving force behind the use of poison gas on the battlefield. Haber personally supervised the release of chlorine gas at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, killing thousands of Allied soldiers in a matter of minutes. While he saw chemical weapons as a scientific solution to military deadlock, the rest of the world viewed them as a horrifying escalation of brutality. The personal cost of Haber's work was profound. His wife, Clara Immerwahr, herself a chemist and outspoken critic of his involvement in chemical warfare, took her own life shortly after the first gas attack, reportedly in despair over his choices. Haber, however, continued his work, convinced he was serving his country. After the war, Haber attempted to rehabilitate his reputation by focusing on agricultural chemistry, but his association with gas warfare haunted him. In the 1930s, as a Jew in Nazi Germany, he was forced to resign from his positions and fled abroad, dying in exile in 1934. Ironically, his legacy also became linked with the Zyklon B pesticide, developed from his earlier research, which was later used in Nazi concentration camps. Fritz Haber remains one of the most controversial scientists in history. His work exemplifies the dual-edged nature of scientific progress, capable of immense good or catastrophic harm, depending on how knowledge is applied. His life is both a triumph of chemistry and a cautionary tale of science in service to power. CRISPR gene-edited babies. In November 2018, the scientific world was rocked by an announcement from Chinese researcher He Jiankui. He had created the first genetically edited human babies. Using the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing tool, he claimed to have altered the DNA of twin girls to make them resistant to HIV. What might have been hailed as a breakthrough was instead condemned globally as one of the most reckless and unethical experiments in modern science. He Jiankui revealed that he had recruited couples where the father was HIV positive and the mother was HIV negative. Using CRISPR during in vitro fertilization, he attempted to disable a gene called CCR5, which HIV uses to enter human cells. The edited embryos were implanted, and in late 2018, twin girls were reportedly born. He later claimed a third gene-edited child was also born. The reaction was immediate and furious. Scientists worldwide denounced the work as premature, unnecessary, and profoundly unethical. For one, the long-term effects of CRISPR edits in humans were unknown, and off-target mutations could cause unpredictable health problems. More importantly, the babies could not consent, meaning irreversible genetic changes were imposed on them without their choice. Beyond medical risks, critics warned of the slippery slope toward designer babies, where genetic engineering could be used not just to prevent disease, but to enhance traits like intelligence, appearance, or strength. The experiment reignited fears of eugenics and the misuse of biotechnology. China's government quickly distanced itself, placing He under investigation. In 2019, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for violating medical regulations and banned from future research. The children, now living anonymously, remain symbols of both scientific possibility and ethical peril. The CRISPR baby scandal forced the scientific community to confront urgent questions. Where should the line be drawn in editing human life? How can science ensure safety, consent, and equity in an age of genetic power? Hwang Woo-suk's experiment may have made history, but it also left a legacy of caution, controversy, and a global call for stronger regulation in gene editing research. Thank you for watching. If you learned anything, throw me a like and comment below on what you would like to see in the future. History never runs out of surprises, and neither do we. So subscribe and join me for the next dive into the archives.